If you've ever felt confused about whether coffee helps or hurts your blood sugar, you're not imagining that confusion. The research genuinely points in two different directions depending on the time frame you're looking at, and almost no video actually explains both halves of that picture clearly. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what the research shows about coffee's long-term relationship with diabetes risk, what actually happens to your blood sugar in the hours right after you drink a cup, why older adults specifically need to think about caffeine a bit differently than younger adults, and exactly how to structure your coffee habit so you get the benefits without the parts that work against you. This is a longer video than usual because this topic genuinely has more nuance than a simple yes or no answer, and I think that nuance is worth understanding properly rather than glossing over. Let's start with the long-term picture because this is the part that surprises people most. Multiple large, long-running studies have found that regular coffee drinkers have a meaningfully lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to people who don't drink coffee at all. One well-known study following more than 126,000 people over 12 to 18 years found that people who increased their coffee intake over time lowered their subsequent diabetes risk, while people who decreased their intake saw their risk rise. Other research has found particularly strong risk reduction among people drinking several cups a day, and notably, this protective association shows up with both regular and decaffeinated coffee, which is an important detail we'll come back to. Researchers believe this long-term protective effect comes from compounds in coffee beyond just caffeine, specifically antioxidants and polyphenols, along with smaller amounts of magnesium and chromium, both of which play a role in how your body's cells respond to insulin. A 2023 study specifically proposed that coffee's anti-inflammatory properties may be a key driver of this effect, since coffee appears to lower pro-inflammatory markers in the body while raising anti-inflammatory ones, and chronic inflammation is now understood to play a meaningful role in how type 2 diabetes develops in the first place, partly by increasing insulin resistance and affecting the cells in the pancreas responsible for producing insulin. So that's genuinely good news, and it's the part most competing videos on this topic actually get right. But here's where it gets more complicated and where a lot of content oversimplifies things. That long-term risk reduction pattern doesn't necessarily describe what happens in your body in the few hours right after you drink a cup of coffee, especially if you already have diabetes or prediabetes. In the short term, caffeine specifically has been shown in research to reduce insulin sensitivity, meaning your cells become somewhat less responsive to insulin's signal to absorb glucose from your bloodstream. The mechanism researchers currently understand involves caffeine raising levels of certain stress hormones, particularly epinephrine, often known as adrenaline. Epinephrine can interfere with how effectively your cells process sugar, and it may also reduce how much insulin your body produces in response to a meal. Caffeine additionally blocks a molecule called adenosine, which plays a role both in how much insulin your body releases and how responsive your cells are to that insulin. For someone without diabetes, this short-term dip in insulin sensitivity typically isn't something the body has much trouble compensating for. But for someone who already has type 2 diabetes, where insulin sensitivity is already reduced, this additional short-term effect can mean blood sugar rises higher after a meal than it otherwise would if caffeine weren't part of the picture and takes longer to come back down to a comfortable range. I want to pause here and address the obvious tension this creates, because I think it's actually the most useful part of this entire video to understand clearly. How can coffee reduce diabetes risk over years while also making blood sugar control harder in the hours right after drinking it? The honest answer is that these are two different biological processes operating on two different time scales, and they're not actually contradictory once you understand that distinction. The long-term protective association appears to come primarily from coffee's antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds, working gradually over months and years to support healthier insulin-producing cells and reduce the chronic inflammation that drives diabetes progression. The short-term blood sugar effect comes specifically from caffeine's acute action on stress hormones and adenosine, which happens within hours of drinking a cup and has nothing to do with the slower, cumulative anti-inflammatory process. Put simply, the beneficial compounds in coffee appear to help your pancreas and insulin-producing cells stay healthier over the long run, while caffeine itself creates a temporary short-term bump in how hard your body has to work to manage blood sugar right after you drink it. Both things are true at the same time, which is exactly why the research can look confusing if you only read the long-term studies or only read the short-term studies without seeing how they fit together. This distinction is also exactly why decaffeinated coffee shows up in research with a similar long-term protective association to regular coffee, since decaf still contains the antioxidants, polyphenols, magnesium, and chromium responsible for the long-term benefit, just without the caffeine responsible for the short-term blood sugar effect. This is one of the most practically useful facts in this entire video, especially for anyone managing diabetes. You don't have to choose between getting coffee's long-term benefits and avoiding caffeine's short-term blood sugar impact. Decaf genuinely offers a way to get much of the former without much of the latter. Now let's talk about why this matters specifically for older adults, since that's the audience this video is built around. Caffeine sensitivity tends to increase with age, partly due to changes in how the liver metabolizes caffeine, meaning it can stay active in the body longer than it would in a younger adult. Certain groups are specifically flagged in medical guidance as needing to be more cautious with caffeine intake, including people with high blood pressure and older adults generally, given caffeine's effects on heart rate, blood pressure, and, as we've covered, blood sugar regulation. This doesn't mean older adults need to avoid coffee. It means the how much, when, and what kind questions matter more than they might for someone younger and without other health considerations, which is exactly what we're going to cover for the rest of this video. Let's talk about how much caffeine is generally considered reasonable. A commonly cited guideline for healthy adults is up to about 400 milligrams of caffeine per day, roughly the amount in 3 to 5 8-ounce cups of coffee, though this general guideline doesn't account for individual sensitivity or specific health conditions, both of which matter more as we age. For some people with diabetes specifically, research has found that as little as 200 milligrams of caffeine, roughly the amount in 2 cups, can produce a noticeable effect on blood sugar, while others show no significant effect at that same amount at all. Caffeine's impact genuinely varies significantly from person to person, which is part of why a personalized approach, rather than a blanket rule, tends to work best. If you want to actually find out how caffeine affects your own blood sugar specifically, there's a simple, practical way to do this if you have access to a glucose monitor, whether a standard glucometer or a continuous glucose monitor. Check your blood sugar at a consistent time after your usual morning coffee for a few days, then skip coffee for a few days and check again at the same time of day and compare the pattern. This kind of simple self-experimentation, ideally discussed with your doctor beforehand, can tell you far more about how your own body specifically responds than any general population study can. Since caffeine metabolism and sensitivity genuinely differ this much from person to person, let's talk about how you take your coffee, because this matters just as much as how much you drink, and it's an area where a lot of people unintentionally undo coffee's potential benefits. Plain black coffee contains no meaningful carbohydrates or sugar on its own, so it doesn't directly raise blood sugar through its ingredients. Any blood sugar effect from black coffee comes specifically from the caffeine mechanism we discussed, not from the coffee itself acting like a food. The moment you add sugar, flavored syrups, or regular dairy creamer, you're introducing a genuine carbohydrate load on top of the caffeine effect. And specialty coffee drinks in particular can be surprisingly loaded with hidden sugar. A large flavored latte can contain as much added sugar as a dessert while still being perceived as just coffee. If you're working on blood sugar management and don't want to give up flavor entirely, unsweetened plant milk, a small amount of cinnamon, or a low glycemic natural sweetener used sparingly are reasonable middle ground options that avoid the bigger sugar load of syrups and standard creamers. Timing relative to meals is another practical piece worth understanding. Since caffeine's short-term effect involves making it somewhat harder for your body to manage the blood sugar rise after eating, drinking coffee alongside or immediately before a carbohydrate-containing meal may compound that post-meal blood sugar rise more than drinking the same coffee on its own, away from meals. This doesn't mean you need to separate coffee and breakfast by hours, but it's a useful piece of awareness if you notice your blood sugar tends to run higher after breakfasts that include coffee compared to breakfasts without it. Let's also address something interesting and slightly counterintuitive from the research. A small pilot study found that caffeine consumed before exercise may actually help lower blood sugar in people with diabetes, which appears to relate to how exercise itself increases insulin sensitivity and glucose uptake by working muscles, potentially offsetting or even reversing caffeine's usual short-term effect in that specific context. This is a smaller, less established finding compared to the broader research we've covered today, so I wouldn't build a strategy entirely around it, but it's a good example of how caffeine's effects aren't fixed and can shift meaningfully depending on the broader context you consume it in. Now let's bring this together into practical guidance. If you're an older adult without diabetes and generally tolerate caffeine well, the long-term research is genuinely reassuring. Moderate coffee intake, taken black or with minimal added sugar, is associated with reduced diabetes risk over time, and there's little reason to avoid it on blood sugar grounds alone. If you have diabetes or prediabetes, the picture calls for a bit more intentionality. Consider whether decaf might let you keep the long-term benefits while reducing the short-term blood sugar effect. Pay attention to whether your particular body shows a noticeable blood sugar response to caffeine using the simple self-check we discussed. Keep your coffee black or very lightly sweetened to avoid stacking a real sugar load on top of the caffeine effect. And if you notice your blood sugar consistently runs higher on days you have coffee with breakfast, experimenting with spacing coffee away from your largest meals may be worth discussing with your doctor or dietitian. And regardless of your diabetes status, if you have high blood pressure or any heart condition, that's a separate additional reason to discuss your specific caffeine intake with your doctor, since caffeine's cardiovascular effects are a distinct consideration from its blood sugar effects. Let's clear up a few myths before we close. Myth 1. Coffee is simply bad for blood sugar, full stop. As we've covered in detail, this oversimplifies genuinely mixed, timescale-dependent research. The long-term association actually favors coffee, while the short-term effect is more nuanced and depends heavily on the individual and on existing diabetes status. Myth 2. If regular coffee is a problem, I should cut out coffee entirely. As we discussed, decaffeinated coffee retains much of the long-term protective association without the short-term caffeine-driven blood sugar effect, making it a genuinely useful middle ground rather than an all-or-nothing choice. Myth 3. A little cream or sugar in my coffee doesn't really matter. Depending on how much and how often, this can meaningfully add up, especially with flavored specialty drinks, and it's worth paying attention to since it's one of the most fixable pieces of this entire picture. And myth 4. Everyone responds to caffeine the same way. As we've covered, individual sensitivity varies substantially, which is exactly why understanding your own pattern, ideally with your doctor's input, matters more than following a single universal rule. To bring this together, coffee has a genuinely well-supported long-term association with lower diabetes risk, likely driven by its antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds working gradually over years. At the same time, caffeine specifically produces a short-term reduction in insulin sensitivity that matters more if you already have diabetes, working through a completely separate, faster-acting mechanism involving stress hormones and adenosine. These two things aren't contradictory, they're simply operating on different timelines. For older adults specifically, caffeine sensitivity tends to increase, and existing guidance flags this as a group worth extra caution with caffeine intake generally, which makes understanding your own personal pattern, keeping your coffee free of excess added sugar, and considering decaf as a genuine middle ground option all worth actually putting into practice, rather than treating coffee as either a simple health food or a simple health risk. If this video was useful, the most helpful thing you can do is share it with someone who's been confused by conflicting coffee advice, since the nuance here is genuinely the most useful part. Subscribe for more evidence-based health content, and I'll see you in the next one.